course. I don't know anything about how to teach an online course. I know a lot of people who have. And I've watched a lot of discussions about online teaching devolve into things like, well, students are wired differently now and the only way they can learn online is online, to the more traditionalist, if you're not meeting face-to-face, this is a horrible travesty. And for me, online learning seems like another mode of delivery that can be used well or used badly. And I'm not here to talk about the perils or pleasures of what's actually involved in online learning, because I don't really know anything about that. What I do know about is the politics of it, and I know that for university administrators, policymakers at a very closely interlocking web of think tanks, institutes, foundations, places like that, and for state legislators, the received wisdom is online learning makes it cheaper. We have a budget problem over here. The way that we're going to solve that at a university is with online learning. If I had a nickel for every legislator who ever said to me, look, just put it all online and then we can cut your budget more, I could retire today. From people who I know and all of the literature that's starting to be produced about online teaching, that notion that online learning is somehow makes it cheaper is deeply counterintuitive. The things that everybody who does it and does it well seem to know is that smaller classes work better for online teaching, that online courses are more work. And again, this seems, smaller classes work better, I think is true for any kind of teaching. Online teaching is just more time consuming and more work because you're dealing with 20 emails from 20 students who are writing you at 3 in the morning and things like that, versus telling 20 students sitting in a classroom one thing one time. So it takes more time. There's also a growing concern about a kind of digital divide, about online learning exacerbating the achievement gap, the possibilities for students from first generation college students, students from ethnic minorities, students who have traditionally and historically been excluded from access to higher education. A lot of the promise of online learning was this is the magic bullet that is going to solve those problems. More and more people who have done it and studies about online learning are showing that that's perhaps not true, that in fact it might be increasing that divide. And again, this seems intuitively right. I mean, Columbia University just did a big study that seemed to find that students from first generation college students, low-income students, were being less and less successful than students from more traditional college-going groups who involved in online courses. And that, again, makes sense. If you're coming from a milieu and a culture that where you know about what college is about, you're engaged in that kind of learning, you have access to fancy technology, you have access to it at appropriate times, you have the leisure time to do it, it makes sense that you would do better than someone who doesn't have all of those things. This leads to, I think, a conclusion that, done right, online classes should not save money. That the magic of onlineness that legislators and policymakers and administrators seems to be not true if you are doing it right. If you have an appropriate and appropriately qualified faculty member teaching the course, you're giving them the resources they need to teach that course, you're giving them the time they need to teach that course, and you're giving them the time they need to interact with their students. It shouldn't save money. In fact, it should probably cost you more because you're adding hardware and software course costs, you're adding technical support costs. That's the big contradiction in the politics of online learning. And I think that contradiction is summed up if you look at two of the earlier ventures into this. Is everybody familiar with the MIT project, their open courseware thing? That for a long time was the gold standard of what we're trying to do online, and I think that the intentions, at least the faculty intentions behind that project, were overwhelmingly good. The idea here is that we are going to bring more knowledge for free to more places and more people, and that's a good thing. If you went to, before they devolved into MIT X and started offering various kinds of sub-MIT credentials and things like that for online learning, if you went to their website 2 years ago, the first thing you saw was a disclaimer that said, none of this stuff counts for MIT credit, and don't even think about getting an MIT degree from doing this. The MIT learning experience is about the interactions with our brilliant MIT faculty, and we wouldn't dream of giving you any kind of credential for these courses. The second thing that you saw was a big red button on the website that said donate here, because this is really expensive. And both of those things are at the polar opposite of what's happening in the for-profit and the nominally non-profit community of online learning. If you go to Kaplan or Phoenix, or in my state, what we have is an entity called Western Governors University. Are you all familiar with that? That Western Governors is now an official university of the state of Washington by legislative decree. And in all of those cases, what they do is take the materials that the MIT people are putting online for free, commodify them, bundle them together, turn them into a commodity that they then turn around and sell to students, and say, look, if you're able to work through this and pass a test, we are happy to give you all the credentials you want. So on the one hand, you have it for free, no credentials, and that seems to me to be the good side of it. The bad side is it costs you money, and we will hand out credentials in a fairly liberal fashion. I think that sort of, I want to put that idea into the context of the position that we find ourselves in public higher education right now. Put it into the context of 40 years of disinvestment in public higher education, 40 years of disinvestment in public infrastructure generally. I mean, budgets for state, and actually y'all are in a little bit better place than most of the rest of the country, I think. That, and I understand that my friend Charlie here tells me that on the horizon, that's about to change because your governor wants to give a lot of money back to oil companies. But what's happened in most of the country, and certainly has happened in my state. I mean, 20 years ago, if you wanted to go to the University of Washington, the state paid 80% of the cost and your tuition covered 20%. That ratio has now been exactly reversed in my state. And that's true. When I went to UCLA in 1979, I paid $900 a year in tuition and fees. What students now, in-state students in California now pay $12,000 a year. Those tuition costs for students have been going dramatically up, not because we're wasting money, not because of anything really except massive public disinvestment in state universities. In the same way that we've seen massive public disinvestment in public infrastructure generally. So you have that situation. You also have, in the same sort of 30, 40-year context, the privatization of public education. Jonathan Kozol, many years back, wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly where he quoted a prospectus from a hedge fund manager on Wall Street, saying that the public education sector is the big enchilada, the big new market for privatization for private profit. Goldman Sachs now owns 150 education companies. The privatization of public education is a huge growth industry right now, in the same way that the privatization of public health care was a big growth industry back in the 70s. And we see, I mean, there's a nice comparison to be made between what's happened with healthcare and what's happening in education. I mean, in the same way that doctors used to be people who you thought of as rich people, who were demonized in some way. as the rich people who played golf on Fridays and made a lot of money. Now, if you want to be a doctor, you're lucky to be living as, a general practitioner kind of doctor, not a specialist. You're lucky to be living as a solid middle-class person. The people who are making the real money are the managers, the HMO people, the people who manage private health care. You also see the stratification of the providers. Where when I was a kid and I went to the doctor, I saw a doctor. Now you'll see a nurse, or a nurse practitioner, or a physician's assistant, and some of that is fine. I mean, some of that is probably work that can be done, but it's the stratification of doctors in the same way that we've seen faculty stratified. Grad assistants, adjuncts of various degrees, and many fewer tenure line faculty teaching many fewer students, and really what's happened is the cutting of faculty labor costs by that kind of stratification. And a rise of an educational managerial class. I mean, this has been one of the ongoing fights that I have with members of our state legislatures. I say, every time you guys want to hold a hearing on education, what you invite is some expert from some think tank that is funded by the Gates Foundation or the Lumina Foundation or the Hewlett Foundation or some other foundation or think tank or project or something like that. You never talk to real faculty. These people all have PhDs. None of them were ever real faculty. They're all paid more than faculty are paid at these private foundations. None of them never had any kind of experience actually teaching students, but they come to in front of policymakers and administrators and legislators and are constantly telling them exactly how it can be done, It's even better, and it's going to be cheaper for you, which is exactly the thing, of course, that legislators want to hear. Policymakers, administrators, and legislators, I mean, this kind of public disinvestment has been going on for so long that everybody takes it for granted. Every time they say to me, how can we make education better? We need more efficiencies. We need more online. I say, why don't you just invest some more money? That would actually help it. They look at me like I'm from Mars. Okay, I mean the shrinking of the public sphere, the shrinking of public education, and that kind of disinvestment is something they take completely for granted, like the weather or the tides or something like that. In that context, you have an increasingly privately funded movement showing up with online learning and promising access and a kind of populist, we are going to bring education to the masses in the way that these snotty universities no longer do, and affordability. We're going to make it cheaper, which is, of course, music to policymakers' ears. The way that they do that, the only way that you can make online learning cheaper, the only way that you can really make any kind of education cheaper, is to cut out the big cost, which is faculty, which is us. It is learning without teachers. The Western governors model, the Kaplan model, the Phoenix model, the nominally nonprofit and for-profit model works like this. They hire someone qualified, someone like one of us, and say, we want you to develop the course. We want you to write the syllabus, the problem sets, the tests, the review papers, all the stuff that we're used to doing and giving the students all the time. They then bundle that together, turn that into the commodity that they turn around and sell to students. The students then are essentially on their own. Okay, what they need to do is work through those things by themselves. And when you ask Western governors or Phoenix or one of those places, who are your faculty? What do? They say, we have this hugely new innovative thing. We have disaggregated the faculty work. And we have the people who develop the course. We have course mentors who assist our students with the course. And we have assessment specialists who evaluate at the end whether or not the student has completed the course in a satisfactory way. All of that is piecework, all of which is taught by much less qualified people than regular faculty, and is for much less money. You get, again, usually fairly well qualified people to bundle things together and to create the course, the commodity that then becomes the property of that institution, that then becomes a thing that they can sell. I mean, they pay us $5,000 and we develop the course, it's then theirs. When the student takes the course, what they get then is sort of the academic equivalent of a phone sex operator or something. We did a little undercover work in my state where we started calling up and acting like prospective students to Western Governors University, and we said, okay, who are my professors? Who am I going to be studying with? This is very exciting. I'm interested to know. They said, well, we don't really have professors. We have course mentors, course facilitators. And we would say, okay, and what will they tell us when we call up and ask them for help? And they said, well, what they'll do is give you strong encouragement and some good cheerleading and refer you to another podcast or another link or something like that. And we'd say, well, so these people aren't experts in the field? Oh, no, not necessarily, but they are experts in motivation and in cheerleading and things like that. And then they have the people who grade the exams at the end that is paid in a piecework kind of way. That's how it saves money. It takes what is the primary cost of any kind of education and takes it away. It is education without teachers. That's really the only way that you cut the cost of education, is to cut out the biggest cost, which is us, which is faculty. It's also creating a kind of, a lot of this stuff is always selling itself. The propaganda around it is always about, this is so new, this is so cutting edge, this is so space age, this is responding to the way that 10-year-olds' brains have been wired since they played their first video game, and they can learn calculus while they're in the grocery store on their iPod. And what it's really done, though, is reverted to some very, very old kind of business models. It's a sort of Fordist, Henry Ford would be very proud. It's a kind of assembly line. You create the course, you do the cheerleading, you do the assessment. And we will devalue that work and pay it less, and not necessarily look for the most qualified people that we can find to do that. That's the model that works, that is being peddled and has been massively funded and just a tremendous movement to sell this to policymakers, to administrators, to legislators. Now, in order to do this, you got the two foundations of online propaganda, and this seems to me to be the thing that we should be most concerned about. In order to do this, what you have to do first is demonize faculty. And every one of the communications, the papers, the think tank projects always cast faculty as resistant, stodgy, not ready to join the 21st century kind of people who probably don't even know how to turn on their computers. There was a memo from the president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities that he sent to all the provosts who were members of that association, saying, their online deal is called the Red Balloon Project. And he said, I've heard that faculty are that paranoid, and I'm quoting here, paranoid and hysterical faculty have risen up to resist, the future, and, we really need to do something about this. There was a man who was a proselytizer for an exquisitely named fellow called Cable Green, who worked for the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges in my state. Every time he would come to testify in the legislature about the value of this kind of stuff, he would talk about how faculty are afraid of the future, and what we need to do is help them into the 21st century. All of this this stuff, one of the backbones of all of the propaganda of this stuff is the demonization of us, the demonization of faculty. This is fairly old. This is maybe 5 or 6 years old now, but it's a project that was done by a guy from the Gates Foundation, and this is the one that I like the best because, and I don't know if the guy got fired or not, with the iPhone from Apple in a Gates Foundation, Microsoft presentation, there might have been some trouble in that. But you see, this is communication, transportation, education, how the tremendous advances that have been made across the years. In the late 19th century, you were tapping a telegraph. In the early 2000s, you're tapping on your iPhone. You used to ride a locomotive across the great country. Now you can go to the moon. But school, you see, has pretty much stayed the same. And I love the, actually, when the picture, black and white, sort of sepia toned black and white. And then even this one, though, somebody took with like an old 1970s Polaroid camera or something. I mean, to make us look old, stodgy, that nothing has changed about education. In the same way that communication and transportation made these huge leaps and bounds, these huge gains in what we've been doing. The problem here is, of course, this guy, the professor here, who is unwilling to join the 21st century and recognize, one of the great ironies about this, of course, is that it's people sitting in places like this who invented all this other stuff. But again, the clear message from this chart is that the problem is this faculty member. The problem is this person continuing to use these 19th century techniques to teach students who need to be alive in a 21st century economy. This is from the same presentation, and this really highlights a lot of the propaganda. Every time you talk to one of these people from the online movement, they'll use words like learner-centric or student-centric. We are moving from a classroom model to a student-centered model. We are moving from a professor-centered model to a student-centered model. The implication being that we as professors who spent the better part of our 20s and early 30s in graduate school, riding our bikes to class while our friends were out getting houses and cars, and then moved across the country to take jobs that don't pay us nearly as much if we had gone to law school like my mother wanted me to. We did all of this because we don't care about students, because we are professor-centric and not student-centric. That somehow people who go into the teaching profession don't understand what it is that students need to learn, don't understand students, and are definitely not in it because they like teaching students stuff. And so you see batch processing of instruction and assessment, adaptive individualized instruction. You can learn on your iPod at night after your kids have gone to bed, that kind of thing. Low levels of engagement and relevance, contextualized learning, anytime, anywhere learning. And the low levels of engagement, this becomes particularly ironic because the low levels of engagement and relevance, the example they always use is a room like this, okay, with 100 students in it and somebody up here talking to those students, and the ones in the back on their phone shopping, or the one asleep in the corner. This is the low levels of engagement and relevance. Online learning would be completely engaged. Teacher as the sage on the stage. Those two things, the low levels of engagement and teachers as the sage on the stage. And again, subtly demonizing the professor, thinking, these teachers are all so full of their own ego that what they most like is to hear themselves talk. And the other irony of this is every time this gets presented, you can go on YouTube and see the TED videos, or there's always somebody standing in front of a crowd talking about how teachers are sage on the stage. The other irony of this is that one of the most popular online solutions to budget problems are MOOCs, are massive online open courses. a MOOC is a big lecture course on giant steroids, right? I mean, if you're in a lecture hall giving a lecture to 200 students, on a MOOC, you're on TV giving a lecture to 200,000 students. I mean, it is, and it always rarefies the professor. This is the professor from Harvard who did this lecture. This is the professor from MIT who did this lecture. Part of what's happening in this shift is to create a much, much smaller and much, much more distant and elite group of left, of universities that are left, with the most badass professors there, and they will give you the lecture on the MOOC with 200,000 people watching, and this is a good thing. It is taking Sage on the stage and turning it into sort of movie star on the stage in some ways, and making it, each instructor develops own courses, teachers as learning facilitators. Okay, that's a big deal, because if, again, they hire someone qualified to develop the course, that becomes the franchise. That becomes the McDonald's thing, the Big Mac that you can take anywhere and hire almost anybody to deliver. This, again, in the guise of being about students, being for students, okay, is really about demonizing faculty, because that is the thing that they most want to get rid of. It is really hearkening back to old, very, very old production line models of teaching, packaged as something new and exciting. That somehow, because it's online, watching a professor give a lecture is better than having it happen in person in a lecture hall. And again, it's about turning teachers into technicians who you can pay much less than you pay professors who are genuinely expert in the field. I remember having an argument with a legislator in my state where he was introducing legislation that would mandate that we all had to put all of our course materials online for free, no matter what. And I said, look, what's the point of this? And he said, it's because the adjunct instructor at Walla Walla Community College, who's been hired 2 weeks before the course has started, needs your, and he was trying to suck up to me, trying to convince me in this way, needs your expertise because you're so smart, you're the real professor, and I said, okay, look, A, you shouldn't be hiring the instructor 2 weeks before a course starts, and B, even if you do, if it's a genuinely qualified instructor, they should be able to come, develop their own course. I mean, one of the ironies of the MIT project, and it shows some of the snottiness of MIT, is a lot of their literature at first said this will be very exciting for professors at other universities who can come and access our materials, and what they learned was that in fact the Open Courseware project at MIT has been mostly used by educated lay people who want to find out something about some other subject. And for that project and all of these open source projects have been incredibly valuable. I went to some of the English courses in the MIT site. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were interesting, some of them weren't. I didn't need the MIT stuff. I mean, we share syllabi, we share each other, we look at each other's materials all the time as a matter of course. I don't need some commodified thing from MIT to tell me how to teach my course. An instructor at Walla Walla Community College, again, if they're genuinely qualified, doesn't need my course materials. And this again is one of the huge ironies of what's happened. Course materials are things that we hand out like